This week starts our fourth and final unit, in which we'll look at the origins of Western civilization, the tradition that our own culture belongs to. Of course, Western civilization owes a lot to the ancient Near East, Egypt, and even China and the Far East. No civilization is completely isolated and independent, and this is even more true for the secondary civilizations that form the basis of the Western tradition. Nevertheless, Western civilization has its own unique history and traditions that are not merely transformations of earlier cultures. In the next several weeks, we'll explore the historical and cultural processes that led to the development of civilization in Europe and the West. We've already discussed the Hittite culture of central Anatolia during the Bronze Age. The language spoken by the Hittites was an Indo-European language, more closely related to those now spoken in Europe than to the languages of the Near East. But Anatolia is still in Asia, and the Hittites remained a basically Near Eastern society. They did, however, control parts of Anatolia that bordered on Europe, as did the Achaemenid Persians centuries later. In both cases, these Near Eastern cultures came into contact with the European cultures, specifically Greek-speaking cultures, who developed civilizations under the influence of their older, more powerful Eastern neighbors. This week we'll look at the Greek cultures contemporary with the Hittites, and next week we'll look at those contemporary with the Persians. The Aegean Sea separates western Anatolia from mainland Greece. Greece itself is a region of steep, rocky mountains that dissect the landscape into narrow valleys. The coastline is a series of long, narrow peninsulas extending into the sea, sometimes separated by flat coastal plains. Throughout the Aegean, there are many small islands known as the Cyclades. The largest Aegean island is Crete, which forms the southern boundary of the sea. Civilization in the form of small states and large towns first formed in the Aegean region during the Bronze Age, which here roughly dates from 3200 to 1050 BC. Chronology in the region is complex, due in part to the centuries of scholarly interest in the region and the differing approaches that scholars have taken. Culture historians divide the Bronze Age into the early period, 3200 to 2100 BC, the Middle Bronze Age, 2100 to 1700, and the Late Bronze Age, 1700 to 1050 BC. They also specify geographical regions within the Aegean. Mainland cultures are referred to as Helladic, Cretan cultures as Minoan, and island cultures as Cycladic. The dates defining early Helladic, for example, are the same as those defining early Minoan and early Cycladic. The only differences lie in the geographical areas where those terms are applied. When referring to the Aegean region as a whole, one simply uses the terms early, middle, or late Bronze Age. So during the late 4th millennium BC and the 3rd millennium BC, Neolithic farming populations began to grow throughout Greece and the Aegean, with villages expanding and increasing signs of social inequality throughout the region. In Crete, during the early Bronze Age, KNOSSOS grew to about 5 hectares in size, and it must have been several times larger and had several times more inhabitants than any neighboring town. Similarly, on the mainland, the town of Lerna built the House of Tiles, a large, finely constructed communal structure that may have served as the home of a local lord, as well as fulfilling public functions. Societies at this time seem to have been somewhat less egalitarian than one would expect for tribal organizations, but not as unequal as one finds in states, so they may have had chiefdom kinds of organizations. But they may also have had some other sort of structure that doesn't fit nicely into our simple band, tribe, chiefdom, state typology. Some of the most interesting archaeological developments during the early Bronze Age happened in the Cyclades. Early Cycladic cultures produced many finely crafted marble figurines, often somewhat less than a foot tall, with strikingly stylized features. These figurines have been highly prized in modern art markets for their perceived similarities to modern abstract sculpture. Some scholars, including Patricia Gretz-Preziosi, have suggested that the figurines were produced in much the same way that modern sculptures are produced, with master craftsmen producing many figurines in a workshop known for their own distinctive styles. That seems a bit unlikely, however, as there's little evidence otherwise to suspect such a highly developed art market existed during the early Cycladic period. In reality, most of the figurines seem to have served relatively common ritual purposes, considering the frequency of their fragments throughout the Cyclades. One site, KAVOS, yielded hundreds of figurine fragments in a clearly ritual context, where they'd been discarded after being deliberately broken during ceremonies. They were also garishly painted in bright colors, with the ancient paint mostly having worn away. Civilization per se really begins in the Aegean during the Middle Bronze Age on Crete. The Middle Minoan period marks the emergence of the first recognizable states on the island, and it's recognized by the presence of palaces. As we saw with ancient China, the patterns of civilization we've come to expect by studying Near Eastern cultures aren't so easily transferred elsewhere. On Crete, Minoan civilization was built upon a structure of palatial administrative centers ruling small kingdoms that divided the island. While relatively large, dense settlements did grow up around these administrative centers, there were no proper cities in the technical sense, and individual states did not control enough land to be considered large territorial states like Egypt or Mitanni. The Middle Minoan period is roughly contemporary with the more Crete-specific term Proto-Palatial period, or the Old Palace period, or the First Palace period. Regardless of which term one uses to refer to it, this is the period during which palaces first appear at Knossos, Mallia, and Festos. At all three sites, huge administrative centers were built in relatively short order about 2100 BC. These centers surrounded large, rectangular open courts with multi-story facilities that combined storage, ritual, and administrative functions. Public ceremonies, perhaps including the fabled bull-leaping games depicted in Minoan art, took place in the open courtyards, while religious and government functions took place in the surrounding rooms. Attached to the palaces were extensive storage facilities, obviously designed to hold large amounts of local agricultural produce, as well as other commodities and imported goods. Parts of the palaces also appear to have been designed as residences for, presumably, the ruling elite. But since residential rooms can be fairly generic, this is difficult to prove with any certainty. During the Proto-Palatial period, Crete seems to have been divided into at least three separate kingdoms, with one centered at each of Knossos, Mallia, and Festos. This does not necessarily mean that the whole island was divided among those three polities, however. Other, as yet unidentified palaces and kingdoms in other parts of the island are possible, as are unincorporated parts of Crete. Why palaces and state-level government evolved on Crete when they did has been an enduring question for archaeologists. We know that by 2100 BC, civilization was well established throughout the Near East, and that trade networks stretched throughout the eastern Mediterranean to feed those cultures. Old Kingdom Egypt and Syrian traders subject to the Akkadian Empire have probably been sailing to Crete for centuries on trading expeditions. The Aegean has plentiful resources of both stone and metals that Near Eastern kings would have wanted, and trade seems to have driven the earlier emergence of states in the Indus River Valley. In the 1970s, British archaeologist Colin Renfrew emphasized the introduction of new crops to the Aegean in this period, especially grapes and olives. These crops provided a valuable resource that was easily controllable by Minoan elites, but which could also be grown on land not otherwise needed for grain production. He believed that, rather than international trade, it was this local economic activity that drove the development of Minoan palaces. Unfortunately, the dating is very murky for the introduction of these crops. They're not definitely established in the archaeological record of Crete until the late Minoan period, though other evidence suggests that they were already present well before 2100 BC. In the end, the timing of Minoan civilization's appearance may be a combination of many factors: internal, external, and perhaps even historically unique circumstances like the appearance of a particularly charismatic leader. What's important is to recognize that Minoan civilization emerged on the fringes of a froth of Bronze Age civilizations in the Near East, and for much of its history it was primarily an eastward-looking culture. About 1700 BC, all of the old palaces were destroyed in what appears to have been a massive earthquake. This marks the transition to the late Minoan, or Neopalatial, or New Palace, or Second Palace period, which lasts until about 1450 BC. All of the old palaces were rebuilt and enlarged soon after their destruction, and a new palace was constructed at Zakro. Possibly there were also new palaces at Chania and at Galatos, though the evidence at those sites is still equivocal. While the Neopalatial period would seem to indicate a greater degree of political fragmentation on Crete, with 4 to 6 palaces rather than just 3, it's also the period when the palace at Knossos grew significantly larger and more elaborate than any of its rivals. Knossos was apparently becoming the 500-pound gorilla of Crete. While it may not have explicitly ruled all of the island, it certainly seems to have been much more powerful than any other palace. Much of the most well-understood aspects of Minoan society date to the Neopalatial period. The modern discovery of the civilization comes from the work of Arthur Evans, excavating the New Palace at Knossos beginning in 1900. Evans, following on much more limited work done by a local scholar, brought to light the previously completely unknown Minoan civilization. When he began his work, he expected to uncover a Mycenaean Greek palace, the details of which we'll examine in a bit, similar to those excavated by Schliemann on the mainland. But he soon realized that the culture of the Cretans was entirely different from the mainland. It was much more closely tied to the Near East, but also unique to the island itself. He coined the term Minoan after Minos, the mythical king of Crete from later Greek mythology. The palace he discovered was certainly deserving of a king as powerful as the mythical Minos. The town of Knossos in the Neopalatial period covered approximately 75 hectares, though it wasn't densely packed. The palace alone, however, covered 2.4 hectares as a single structure with hundreds of rooms and multiple stories. It enclosed 2 large courtyards, the larger of which was 25 by 50 meters. Onto the central court opened all the important rooms of the palace, ritual rooms and shrines, the suspected royal residences, and most importantly, the throne room. This was a room with a carved gypsum seat set into the plaster wall, and flanked with frescoes of winged griffins protecting the ruler. The frescoes of Knossos are another famous discovery. Frescoes are made by painting wet plaster, sealing the colors into the plaster permanently. Evans was stunned to find that almost 3,500 years after they were painted, many Knossos frescoes were still vibrantly colored and recognizable. The plaster had long since flaked off the walls, and some of Evans' reconstructions have since proven to be wrong, but he recognized the images of ritual processions, nature scenes, and, most famously, the bull leaping game. Now, in later mythology, the palace of Minos at Knossos was the site of the labyrinth, where Minos kept the monstrous Minotaur, a monster with the body of a human and the head of a bull. Every year, youths were sacrificed to the Minotaur by being thrown into the labyrinth. Evans found that the palace at Knossos was, in fact, a bewildering maze of twisting corridors and dead-end chambers, and that terrifying confrontations between young people and bulls had, apparently, played a role in Minoan festivities. Furthermore, Minoan art placed a strong emphasis on the image of a double axe, a labrys, in some versions of Greek, which would explain the term labyrinth. It seemed reasonable to Evans that he'd found the historical basis of the Minotaur myth. In typical conservative fashion, later archaeologists have suggested he was too eager to find the truth of the myths, and that there are more details that do not fit than do. It's clear, however, that some memory of the Minoans lays behind Greek myths of Crete. During the Neopalatial period, Minoan influence spread beyond Crete itself into the Cycladic islands. There's some debate about whether these islands were actually incorporated into a Minoan state, probably the one ruled from Knossos, or if they were just heavily influenced by their neighbors. Regardless, islands throughout the Aegean increasingly adopted Minoan ceramic, architectural, and artistic styles. This period is sometimes referred to as the Minoan thalassocracy, a term that means rule of the sea, and it harkens back to Minos' mythological empire that spread throughout the Aegean. Nothing so sophisticated as a Minoan empire ever existed in reality, however. If direct rule ever extended past Crete at all, it was to a few isolated islands and nothing more. The most important of these Minoanized islands was THERA, also known as Santorini, where the town of AKROTIRI was destroyed by a volcanic eruption sometime in the early part of the Late Bronze Age. This effectively sealed and preserved the town like a time capsule until it was rediscovered and excavated beginning in the 1960s. The Neopalatial period coincides with the appearance of states on the Greek mainland, the Mycenaean culture, and it appears that mainland Greeks played some role in the end of the new palaces. Around 1450 BC, all of the palaces on Crete were sacked and burned. Soon thereafter, Knossos was rebuilt, beginning the Third Palace period. It would remain the only operating palace on the island, and it was also now under the control of the Greek-speaking peoples. We know this because, like almost all states, Minoan kingdoms were literate, and their bureaucracies were concerned with maintaining careful records. During the Old Palace period, they had used a form of writing called Minoan hieroglyphics, which was incised in clay tablets much like Near Eastern cuneiform. With the beginning of the New Palace period, they shifted to a new, more efficient system known as Linear A. Neither of these scripts have been deciphered, but linguists have been able to determine that the Minoan language was Semitic, linked to Akkadian and Hebrew. With the advent of the Third Palace period at Knossos, the script shifts again to Linear B, which has been deciphered as a form of early Greek. Furthermore, Linear B archives have also been discovered at mainland palace sites like PYLOS. So what happened around 1450 BC on Crete? Seemingly, Mycenaeans from the mainland somehow brought about a major restructuring of Cretan society. Multiple kingdoms were destroyed, and the one that was rebuilt, Knossos, was now under the control of a different linguistic group. This has long been understood as an invasion and conquest, and that still seems the most likely explanation, but there is reason to doubt. Elite burials from the Third Palace period indicate that the ruling elite were still born and raised in Crete, which might suggest that the Knossos rulers, at least, were willingly brought into the Mycenaean sphere and not forcibly replaced by mainland immigrants. Perhaps a generation of rulers at Knossos teamed up with mainland allies to overthrow their Minoan rivals. Whatever the case, for the remainder of the Bronze Age, Crete's attention turned from the Near East to its northern neighbors, and Crete served as a periphery of the Mycenaean world rather than a power in its own right. Let's turn our attention now to developments on the mainland of Greece and see where those Mycenaean maybe invaders came from. As I said, mainland Greece is a landscape of steep, rocky mountains and narrow valleys. This is especially true in the east and north, regions known as Attica and Boeotia, but less so in western Greece. Here, the large peninsula known as the Peloponnesus has several broad, flat plains. It was in this region, about 1600 BC, that the first Mycenaean palaces appeared. The late Helladic period, from circa 1700 to 1050 BC, is the Mycenaean period, during which a dozen or more small kingdoms arose throughout Greece. After he completed his work at Troy in Turkey, Heinrich Schliemann moved to Greece to further investigate the early Greeks. Unlike Troy, those sites had never been lost to history, though most scholars in the 19th century believed them to be unimportant towns rather than the centers of influential kingdoms. In 1876 and 1877, Schliemann dug at Mycenae and Tiryns and proved those doubtful scholars wrong. Sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and Athens were the seats of small kingdoms that dominated the landscape around the palace, but they were not city-states in the Mesopotamian sense. For one thing, they were not cities in any real sense, but something between those Chinese urban clusters and large towns. Mycenaean capitals did have resident populations of commoners who worked to feed themselves, but much of the economic activity in the capital towns was devoted to supporting the palace and its kings. Meanwhile, the great bulk of the kingdom's common populace lived in rural farming villages scattered around the landscape. The single greatest service that Mycenaean kings provided to their followers was security. As was true of later periods of Greek history, the Bronze Age was one of continuous warfare among Greek states. The militaristic nature of Mycenaean states can be seen in almost any aspect of their culture. The towns and palaces themselves are often heavily fortified behind thick stone walls, and iconography on Mycenaean art often shows warriors going to battle wearing heavy armor. Rulers and other elites didn't just depict warfare, though. They obviously carried it out. At the site of DENDRA, archaeologists recovered a full-body suit of bronze armor from a Mycenaean grave, equipment that must have been fantastically expensive, but also cutting-edge defense against any enemy attack. There are also archaeologically known examples of boar's tusk helmets. These were leather caps covered on the outside with split boar's tusks. Since each boar only provided 4 tusks, it took many boars to create a single helmet. Any warrior capable of hunting and killing that many boars was a dangerous foe, and this was clearly the intended message of such helmets. All of this should not be taken to imply that Mycenaean elites lived anything less than a luxurious life. The burials in Mycenae's famous shaft graves indicate that even very early in the Mycenaean period, rulers had access to great wealth. The construction of their lavish palaces also indicates that they had plenty of time and resources to devote to matters other than warfare. The typical Mycenaean palace was built around a structure known as a megaron. The megaron was the central hall and meeting place of the palace, and the place where the king received visitors and conducted business. As is typical of such early state interaction spheres, all Mycenaean palaces had their own megaron that followed the same basic plan. In the center of a large, more or less square room stood a large round hearth. Surrounding the hearth were 4 large columns that supported the roof, and on one side was a raised dais where presumably the king would sit. To the side of the king's dais was a single door into the megaron, which entered from a small antechamber. Opposite this door to the megaron itself, the antechamber opened onto a long columned porch, the same width as the whole megaron complex. Anywhere this architectural unit can be found, you can be sure a Mycenaean king once lived. Outside the palace and its enclosing walls, which were often located at the top of a hill, sat the lower town. As the Mycenaean period progressed, more and more of these lower towns were enclosed by massive fortification walls. Most were built of stone, many of ashlars, large rectangular blocks of stone shaped similarly to giant bricks. Others, such as the famous walls of Tiryns, were built of Cyclopean masonry. This uses naturally occurring boulders with a minimum of shaping to fit together to form a complex, almost interlocking pattern. As a side note, your textbook misidentifies the masonry in figure 9.8. That photo shows ashlar masonry. There is Cyclopean masonry at Mycenae. It's just out of frame to the right, but it's not shown in this figure 9.8. Now, such large-scale projects as the enclosing of an entire town in thick ashlar-built walls could only have been undertaken as public works projects to protect the populace outside the palace. Other signs of the Mycenaean king's governance include extensive road networks throughout several parts of Greece, and the Linear B archives recovered from the palace at PYLOS. These records reveal that the PYLOS kingdom was administered through an extensive and flexible bureaucracy that was concerned with more than just the residents of the palace. Mycenaean culture, the 16th through 13th centuries BC, thus looks very different in many respects from the contemporary Neopalatial society on Crete. Minoan kings appear to have been relatively non-violent, with their authority based on religious and ceremonial duties. Mycenaean kings were warlords, tasked with the defense of their domains and people. Perhaps that's the reason that Minoan kings are relatively anonymous, with few grandiose tombs and no artistic depictions. But Mycenaean kings were buried with great pomp and lavish funerary goods. For Minoan kings to have self-aggrandized like that would have been disrespectful of the gods they worshipped. But the Mycenaean kings had won their reputations through hard fighting and bloody work, so they felt they deserved elaborate rituals. The last topic I'd like to address here is the relationship between the Bronze Age Aegean cultures and the later Greek cultures of the first millennium BC. Mycenaean palaces throughout Greece were occupied and functioned as seats of government until about 1200 BC, when all of them were destroyed in a relatively short period of time. Thereafter, the last portion of the Late Bronze Age is known as the POSTPALATIAL period, from about 1200 to 1050 BC, on both the mainland and on Crete. This is a period of decline that coincides with the arrival of the Sea Peoples in the Near East. Earlier Hittite records had recorded conflicts with the Ahiahwa in western Anatolia, and a name that is suspiciously reminiscent of Aegean, a name that later Greeks had for their ancestors. New Kingdom Egyptian records also mention frequent visits from an island nation of Keftiu, which could only be Minoan Crete. And the art and ceramic styles of the Philistines in the southern Levant indicate that they were almost certainly Mycenaean immigrants. All of this evidence strongly indicates that the Mycenaean palaces were destroyed as part of a series of complex political and social developments that took place throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The causes of those developments remain extremely murky, however. Now, following the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces, population levels in Greece dropped, probably because large portions of the population moved eastward as part of the Sea Peoples. Urbanization reversed, with the largest settlements becoming much smaller. Linear B writing was used less and less, and Greek-speaking society became effectively illiterate again by 1050 BC. When writing next returned to Greece in the 8th century BC, it was with an alphabetic script, borrowed from the Phoenicians. Those archaic period Greeks of the 8th and later centuries had not completely forgotten their Bronze Age ancestors. In fact, much of their oral literature, which later got written down, was devoted to retelling events thought to have happened in the centuries when kingdoms had ruled throughout Greece. The two greatest literary works of this period are the Iliad and the Odyssey, both attributed to a single poet, Homer, but more likely the result of centuries of oral transmission by hundreds of poets. Much of the Iliad and Odyssey seem to be genuine recollections of the Bronze Age Mycenaean culture, a landscape of small kingdoms ruled by warrior kings, the most powerful of which were Mycenae, Tiryns, PYLOS, and so forth. Even the general conflict, a war with Troy in northwestern Anatolia, might recall a historical war with the Hittites or one of their allied states. If our archaeological dating methods are reliable, the Trojan War would have happened in the 13th century BC, not long before the ultimate collapse of Mycenaean civilization. Surprisingly, Greek legend recalls events up to a generation after the Trojan War, but no farther. On the other hand, there is much in Homeric epic and other Greek mythological tradition that does not fit the Bronze Age. Homer's warriors fight with iron weapons, which were not available to the Bronze Age Mycenaeans. They're also cremated at death, a practice that only became widespread long after the end of the Mycenaean period. Maybe most surprising, though, is that Homer makes almost no mention whatsoever of literacy in his epics. As products of the illiterate Dark Age, Homer and his contemporaries seem to have been unaware that their ancestors were familiar with writing. So, while later Greek legends may have been helpful in guiding Schliemann to Troy and Mycenae and Evans to Knossos, they cannot be relied on as verified historical fact. As with all historical documents, they're as much a product of their own time as a product of historical events that they recount. We must be careful to view them as the later Greeks themselves would have, and not to simply assume that the man in the shaft grave at Mycenae was Agamemnon, and the one on the throne at Knossos was Minos. That being said, the great number of specific points of correspondence between Bronze Age archaeology and later Greek tradition indicates a great degree of cultural continuity between the 2nd and 1st millennia BC in Greece. Next week, We'll look at the Greek cultures that emerged from the end of the Bronze Age to redefine civilization in the second half of the first millennium.